All right, 5th and 6th grade. What is going to happen in Chapter 10? Let's dive right in. Commuter capsule in trouble. Canid attack number 1. While Shuckworth, Shanks, and Showler were being chased out of the space hotel by the Canids, Mr. Wonka's great glass elevator was orbiting the Earth at tremendous speed. Mr. Wonka had all his booster rockets firing, and the elevator was reaching speeds of 34,000 miles an hour instead of the normal 17,000. They were trying, you see, to get away from that huge, angry, vermicious Canid with the purple behind. Mr. Wonka wasn't afraid of it, but Grandma Josephine was petrified. Every time she looked at it, she let out a piercing scream and clapped her hands over her eyes. But of course 34,000 miles an hour is dawdling to a Canid. Healthy young Canids think nothing of traveling 1,000,000 miles between lunch and supper, and then another 1,000,000 before breakfast the next day. How else could they commute between the planet Vermes and other stars? Mr. Wonka should have known this and saved his rocket power, but he kept right on going, and the giant Canid kept right on cruising effortlessly alongside. Let me try that again. Mr. Wonka should have known this and saved his rocket power, but he kept right on going, and the giant Canid kept right on cruising effortlessly alongside, glaring into the elevator with its wicked red eye. "You people have bruised my backside," the Canid seemed to be saying, "and in the end I'm going to get you for that." They had been streaking around the Earth like this for 45 minutes when Charlie, who was floating comfortably beside Grandpa Joe near the ceiling, said suddenly, "There's something ahead. Can you see it, Grandpa? Straight in front of us." I can, Charlie. I can." "My goodness, it's the space hotel." "It can't be, Grandpa. We left it miles behind us long ago." "Ah ha ha," said Mr. Wonka. "We've been going so fast we've gone all around the Earth and caught up with it again. A splendid effort." "And there's the commuter capsule. Can you see it, Grandpa? It's just behind the space hotel." "There's something else there too, Charlie, if I'm not mistaken." "I know what those are," screamed Grandma Josephine. "They're vermicious Canids. Turn back at once." "Reverse," yelled Grandma Georgina. "Go the other way." "Dear lady," said Mr. Wonka, "this isn't an automobile on the highway. When you are in orbit, you cannot stop and you cannot go backward." "I don't care about that," shouted Grandma Josephine. "Put on the brakes. Stop. Backpedal. The Canids will get us." "Now let's just stop this nonsense once and for all," Mr. Wonka said sternly. "You know very well my elevator is completely Canid-proof. You have nothing to fear." They were closer now, and they could see the Canids pouring out from the tail of the space hotel and swarming like wasps around the commuter capsule. "They're attacking it," cried Charlie. "They're after the commuter capsule." It was a fearsome sight. The huge green egg-shaped Canids were grouping themselves into squadrons with about 20 Canids to a squadron. Then each squadron formed itself into a line with 1 yard between Canids. Then one after another the squadrons began attacking the commuter capsule. They attacked in reverse with their pointed rear ends in front, and they came in at a fantastic speed. Wham! One squadron attacked, bounced off and wheeled away. Crash! Another squadron smashed against the side of the commuter capsule. "Get us out of here, you madman!" screamed Grandma Josephine. "What are you waiting for?" "They'll be coming after us next," yelled Grandma Georgina. "Please, man, turn back." "I doubt very much if that capsule of theirs is Canid-proof," said Mr. Wonka. "Then we must help them," cried Charlie. "We've got to do something. There are 150 people inside that thing." Down on the Earth, in the White House study, the president and his advisors were listening in horror to the voices of the astronauts over the radio. "They're coming at us in droves," Shuckworth was shouting. "They're bashing us to bits." "But who?" yelled the president. "You haven't even told us who's attacking you." "These dirty, great, greenish-brown brutes with red eyes," shouted Shanks, butting in. "They're shaped like enormous eggs, and they're coming at us backwards." "Backwards?" cried the president. "Why backwards?" "Because their bottoms are even more pointy than their tops," shouted Shuckworth. "Look out, here comes another lot." "We won't be able to stand this much longer, Mr. President. The waitresses are screaming and the chambermaids are all hysterical and the bellhops are being sick and the hall porters are saying their prayers. What shall we do, Mr. President, sir? What on earth shall we do? Fire your rockets and make a re-entry, shouted the president. Come back to earth immediately. That's impossible, cried Showler. They've busted our rockets. They've smashed them to smithereens. We're cooked, Mr. President, shouted Shanks. We're done for, because even if they don't succeed in destroying the capsule, we'll have to stay up here in orbit for the rest of our lives. We can't make a re-entry without rockets. The president was sweating, and the sweat ran all the way down the back of his neck and inside his collar. Any moment now, Mr. President, Shanks went on, we're going to lose contact with you altogether. There's another lot coming at us from the left, and they're aiming straight for our radio antenna. Here they come. I don't think we'll be able to... The voice cut out. The radio went dead. Shanks! Cried the president. Where are you, Shanks? Shuckworth! Shanks! Showler! Showworth! Shucks! Shankler! Shankworth! Shuckler! Why don't you answer me? Up in the great glass elevator, where they had no radio and could hear nothing of these conversations, Charlie was saying, surely their only hope is to make a re-entry and dive back to Earth quickly. Yes, said Mr. Wonka, but in order to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere, they've got to kick themselves out of the orbit. They've got to change course and head downward, and to do that, they need rockets. But their rocket tubes are all dented and bent. You can see them from here. They're crippled. Why can't we tow them down? Charlie asked. Mr. Wonka jumped. Even though he was floating, he somehow jumped. He was so excited he shot upward and hit his head on the ceiling. Then he spun around 3 times in the air and cried, Charlie, you've got it! That's it! We'll tow him out of orbit! To the buttons, quick! What do we do to tow him? Grandpa Joe asked. Our neckties? Don't you worry about a little thing like that, cried Mr. Wonka. My great glass elevator is ready for anything. In we go. Into the breach, dear friends. Into the breach. Stop him, screamed Grandma Josephine. You be quiet, Josie, said Grandpa Joe. There's someone over there needs a helping hand, and it's our job to give it. If you're frightened, you better just close your eyes tight and stick your fingers in your ears. Chapter 11, The Battle of the Canids. Grandpa Joe, sir, shouted Mr. Wonka. Kindly let yourself over to the far corner of the elevator there and turn that handle. It lowers the rope. A rope's no good, Mr. Wonka. The Canids will bite through a rope in a second. It's a steel rope, said Mr. Wonka. It's made of rain-scorched steel. If they try to bite through that, their teeth will splinter like spilikins. To your buttons, Charlie. You've got to help me maneuver. We're going right over to the top of the commuter capsule, and then we'll try to hook onto it somewhere and get a firm hold. Like a battleship going into action, the great glass elevator with booster rockets firing moved smoothly in over the top of the enormous commuter capsule. The Canids immediately stopped attacking the capsule and went for the elevator. Squadron after squadron of giant vermicious Canids flung themselves furiously against Mr. Wonka's marvelous machine. Wham! Crash! Bang! The noise was thunderous and terrible. The elevator was tossed about the sky like a leaf, and inside it, Grandma Josephine, Grandma Georgina, and Grandpa George, floating in their nightshirts, were all yowling and screeching and flapping their arms and calling for help. Mrs. Bucket had wrapped her arms around Mr. Bucket and was clasping him so tightly that one of his shirt buttons punctured his skin. Charlie and Mr. Wonka, as cool as 2 cantaloupes, were up near the ceiling working the booster rocket controls, and Grandpa Joe, shouting war cries at the Canids, was down below turning the handle that unwound the steel rope. At the same time, he was watching the rope through the glass floor of the elevator. Starboard a bit, Charlie, shouted Grandpa Joe. We're right on top of her now. Forward a couple of yards, Mr. Wonka. I'm trying to get the hook hooked around the stumpy little sticking out thing in front of there. Hold it. I've got it. That's it. Forward a little now and see if it holds. More. The big steel rope tightened. It held. And now, wonder of wonders, with their booster rockets blazing, the elevator began to tow the huge commuter capsule forward and away. Full speed ahead, shouted Grandpa Joe. She's going to hold. She's holding fine. All boosters firing, cried Mr. Wonka, and the elevator leaped ahead. Still the rope held. Mr. Wonka jetted himself down to Grandpa Joe and shook him warmly by the hand. "Well done, sir," he said. "You did a brilliant job under heavy fire." Charlie looked back at the commuter capsule some 30 yards behind him at the end of the tow line. It had little windows up front, and in the windows he could clearly see the flabbergasted faces of Shuckworth, Shanks, and Shaller. Charlie waved to them and gave them a thumbs-up signal. They didn't wave back. They simply looked. They couldn't believe what was happening. Grandpa Joe blew himself upward and hovered beside Charlie, bubbling with excitement. "Charlie, my boy," he said, "we've been through a few funny things together lately, but never anything like this." "Grandpa, where are the Canids? They've suddenly vanished." Everyone looked around. The only Canid in sight was their old friend with the purple behind, still cruising alongside in its usual place, still glaring into the elevator. "Just a minute!" cried Grandma Josephine. "What's that I see over there?" Again they looked, and this time, sure enough, away in the distance, in the deep blue sky of outer space, they saw a massive cloud of vermicious Canids wheeling and circling like a fleet of bombers. "If you think we're out of the woods yet, you're crazy," shouted Grandma Georgina. "I fear no Canids," said Mr. Wonka. "We've got 'em beaten now." "Poppy rotten pigwash," said Grandma Josephine. "Any moment now they'll be at us again. Look at 'em, they're coming in. They're coming closer." This was true. The huge fleet of Canids had moved in at incredible speed and was now flying level with the great glass elevator a couple of 100 yards away on the right-hand side. The one with the bump on its rear end was much closer, only 20 yards away on the same side. "It's changing shape," cried Charlie. "That nearest one, what's it going to do?" "It's getting longer and longer." And indeed, it was. The mammoth egg-shaped body was slowly stretching itself out like chewing gum, becoming longer and longer and thinner, until in the end it looked exactly like a long, slimy green serpent, as thick as a tree and as long as a football field. At the front end were the eyes, big and white, with red centers. At the back, a kind of tapering tail, and at the very end of the tail was the enormous, round, swollen bump it had gotten when it crashed against the glass. The people floating inside the elevator watched and waited. Then they saw the long, rope-like Canid turning and coming straight around, but quite slowly toward the great glass elevator. Now it began actually wrapping its ropey body around the elevator itself. Once around it went, then twice around, and very horrifying it was to be inside and to see the soft, green body squishing against the outside of the glass no more than a few inches away. "It's tying us up like a package," yelled Grandma Josephine. "Bunkum," said Mr. Wonka. "It's going to crush us in its coils," wailed Grandma Georgina. "Never," wailed Mr. Wonka. Charlie glanced quickly back at the commuter capsule. The sweet white faces of Shuckworth, Shanks, and Shaller were pressed against the glass of the little windows, terror-struck, stupefied, stunned, their mouths open, their expressions frozen like fish fingers. Once again, Charlie gave them the thumbs-up signal. Shaller acknowledged it with a sticky grin, but that was all. "Oh," screamed Grandma Josephine, "get that beastly squishy thing away from here." Having curled its body twice around the elevator, the Canid now proceeded to tie a knot with its two ends, a good strong knot, left over right, then right over left. When it had pulled the knot tight, there remained about 5 yards of one end hanging loose. This was the end with the eyes on it. But it didn't hang loose for long. It quickly curled itself into the shape of a huge hook, and the hook stuck straight out sideways from the elevator as though waiting for something else to hook itself onto it. While all this was going on, nobody had noticed the other Canids. "Mr. Wonka!" Charlie cried. "Look at the others! What are they doing?" What indeed? These two had all changed shape and had become longer, but not nearly so long or so thin as the first one. Each of them had turned itself into a kind of thick rod, and the rod was curled around at both ends, at the tail end and at the head end, so that it made a double-ended hook. And now all the hooks were linking up into one long chain, 1,000 Canids all joining together and curving around in the sky to make a chain of Canids half a mile long. And the Canid at the very front of the chain, whose front hook was not, of course, hooked up to anything, was leading them in a wide circle and sweeping in toward the great glass elevator. "Hey," shouted Grandpa Joe, "they're going to hook up with us, this brute who's tied himself around us, and tow us away," cried Charlie. "To the planet Vermes," gasped Grandma Josephine. 18,427 miles from here. "They can't do that," cried Mr. Wonka. "We're doing the towing around here." "They're going to link up, Mr. Wonka," Charlie said. "They really are. Can't we stop them? They're going to tow us away, and they're going to tow the people we're towing away as well." "Do something!" shrieked Grandma Georgina. "Don't just float about looking at them." "I must admit," said Mr. Wonka, "that for the first time in my life, I find myself at a bit of a loss." They all stared in horror through the glass at the long chain of vermicious Canids. The leader of the chain was coming closer and closer. The hook, with two big, angry eyes on it, was out and ready. In 30 seconds, it would line up with the hook of the Canid wrapped around the elevator. "I want to go home," wailed Grandma Josephine. "Why can't we just go home?" "Great thundering tomcats," cried Mr. Wonka. "Home is right. What on earth am I thinking of? Come on, Charlie, quick, re-entry. You take the yellow button. Press it for all you're worth. I'll handle this lot." Charlie and Mr. Wonka literally flew to the buttons. "Hold your hats," shouted Mr. Wonka. "Grab your gizzards. We're going down." Rockets started firing out of the elevator from all sides. It tilted and gave a sickening lurch and then plunged downward into the Earth's atmosphere at a simply colossal speed. "Retro rockets!" bellowed Mr. Wonka. "I mustn't forget to fire the retro rockets." He flew over to another series of buttons and started playing on them like a piano. The elevator was now streaking downward head first, upside down, and all the passengers found themselves floating upside down as well. "Help! All the blood's rushing to my head," Grandma Georgina screamed. "Then turn yourself the other way up," said Mr. Wonka. "That's easy enough, isn't it?" Everyone blew and puffed and turned somersaults in the air until at last they were all the way. Everyone blew and puffed and turned somersaults in the air until at last they were all the right way up. "How's the tow rope holding, Grandpa?" Mr. Wonka called out. "They're still with us, Mr. Wonka, sir. The rope's holding fine." It was an amazing sight. The great elevator streaking down toward the Earth with the huge commuter capsule in tow behind it. But the long chain of Canids was coming after him, following him down, keeping pace with him easily. And now the hook of the leading Canid in the chain was actually reaching out and grasping for the hook made by the Canid on the elevator. "We're too late!" screamed Grandma Georgina. "They're going to link up and haul us back." "I think not," said Mr. Wonka. "Don't you remember what happens when a Canid enters the Earth's atmosphere at high speed? He gets red hot. He burns away in a long fiery trail. He becomes a shooting Canid. Soon these dirty beasts will start popping like popcorn." As they streaked on downward, sparks began to fly off the sides of the elevator. The glass glowed pink, then red, then scarlet. Sparks also began to fly off the long chain of the Canids, and the leading Canid in the chain started to shine like a red-hot poker. So did all the others. So did the great slimy brute coiled around the elevator itself. This one, in fact, was trying frantically to uncoil itself and get away, but it was having trouble untying the knot, and in another 10 seconds, it began to sizzle. Inside the elevator, they could actually hear the sizzling. It made a noise like bacon frying. And exactly the same sort of thing was happening to the other 1,000 Canids in the chain. The tremendous heat was simply sizzling them up. They were red hot, every one of them. Then suddenly, they became white hot, and they gave out a dazzling white light. "They're shooting Canids!" cried Charlie. "What a splendid sight," said Mr. Wonka. "It's better than fireworks." In a few seconds more, the Canids had blown away in a cloud of ashes, and it was all over. We've done it, cried Mr. Wonka. They've been roasted to a crisp. They've been fizzled to a fritter. We're saved. What do you mean saved? Said Grandma Josephine. We'll all be frizzled ourselves if this goes on any longer. We'll be barbecued like beefsteaks. Look at that glass. It's hotter than a fizz gig. Have no fears, dear lady, answered Mr. Wonka. My elevator is air-conditioned, ventilated, aerated, and automated in every possible way. We're going to be all right now. I haven't the faintest idea what's been going on, said Mrs. Bucket, making one of her rare speeches. But whatever it is, I don't like it. Aren't you enjoying it, Mother? Charlie asked her. No, she said, I'm not, nor is your father. What a great sight it is, said Mr. Wonka. Just look at the earth down there, Charlie, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And us going to meet it at 2,000 miles an hour, groaned Grandma Georgina. How are you going to slow, for heaven's sake? You didn't think of that, did you? He's got parachutes, Charlie told her. I'll bet he's got great big parachutes that open just before we hit. Parachutes, said Mr. Wonka with contempt. Parachutes are only for astronauts and sissies. And anyway, we don't want to slow down. We want to speed up. I've told you already, we've got to be going at an absolutely tremendous speed when we hit. Otherwise, we'll never punch our way in through the roof of the chocolate factory. How about the commuter capsule? Charlie asked anxiously. We'll be letting them go in a few seconds now, Mr. Wonka. They do have parachutes, 3 of them, to slow them down on the last bit. How do you know we won't land in the Pacific Ocean? Said Grandma Josephine. I don't, said Mr. Wonka, but we all know how to swim, do we not? This man, shouted Grandma Josephine, is crazy as a crumpet. He's cracked as a crawfish, cried Grandma Georgina. Down and down plunged the great glass elevator. Nearer and nearer came the earth below. Oceans and continents rushed up to meet them, getting bigger every second. Grandpa Joe, sir, throw out the rope. Let it go, ordered Mr. Wonka. They'll be all right now so long as their parachutes are working. Rope gone, called out Grandpa Joe, and the huge commuter capsule, on its own now, began to swing away to one side. Charlie waved to the 3 astronauts in the front window. None of them waved back. They were still sitting there in kind of shocked daze, gaping at the old ladies and the old men and the small boy floating about in the glass elevator. It won't be long now, said Mr. Wonka, reaching for a row of tiny pale blue buttons in one corner. We shall soon know whether we are alive or dead. Keep very quiet, please, for this final part. I have to concentrate awfully hard. Otherwise, we'll come down in the wrong place. They plunged into a thick bank of clouds, and for 10 seconds they could see nothing. When they came out of the clouds, the commuter capsule had disappeared, and the earth was very close. And there was only a great spread of land beneath them with mountains and forests, then fields and trees, then a small town. There it is, shouted Mr. Wonka. My chocolate factory, my beloved chocolate factory. You mean Charlie's chocolate factory, said Grandpa Joe. That's right, said Mr. Wonka, addressing Charlie. I'd clean forgotten. I do apologize to you, my dear boy. Of course it's yours. And here we go. Through the glass floor of the elevator, Charlie caught a quick glimpse of a huge red roof and the tall chimneys of the giant factory. They were plunging straight down into it. Hold your breath, shouted Mr. Wonka. Hold your nose, fasten your seatbelts, and say your prayers. We're going through the roof. And that's the end of chapter 11. Now, I will send you all a lesson, a short assignment to do, some comprehension questions on the last few chapters. I'll send that on your messenger or your texting thing that Miss Julie sends you things on, okay? All right, see you tomorrow. Bye.